Richard Patterson froze mid-step, his Italian leather shoes grinding against the Central Park gravel as his eyes locked onto an impossible scene. His 10-year-old daughter Emma sat cross-legged beneath the ancient oak tree, completely absorbed as a homeless black girl with matted hair and torn clothes patiently explained advanced calculus using twigs and leaves. This wasn't supposed to happen in his carefully controlled world. The nanny's scream pierced the afternoon air as she spotted them from across the meadow, her designer purse tumbling to the ground. Other parents stopped their conversations, children paused their games, and joggers slowed to stare at the unthinkable tableau. Richard's hands trembled as memories he'd buried for 40 years clawed at his consciousness, a different park, a different lifetime, when he was the one in rags receiving kindness from someone who looked just like this girl. The worn composition book in her lap bore equations he recognized, formulas that had once saved his life. "Security," he whispered into his phone, his voice betraying none of the earthquake rumbling through his chest. But his finger hesitated over the call button. Who was this child who had somehow reached his unreachable daughter? And why did her patient smile remind him of someone he'd tried so desperately to forget? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Richard Patterson had stood in the marble-floored foyer of his $50 million penthouse, watching his daughter Emma trudge through the front door with the weight of the world on her 10-year-old shoulders. Her St. Catherine's Academy uniform hung perfectly pressed. Her blonde hair still held its careful braids, but her blue eyes carried the hollow emptiness that had haunted her since her mother's death 2 years prior. "How was school today, sweetheart?" he asked, glancing up from his phone where stock prices flickered in real time. The question had become routine, mechanical, a box to check in his mental list of fatherly duties. Emma shrugged, her backpack sliding off one shoulder. "Mrs. Henderson says I need a tutor for math again." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "She says I'm not trying hard enough." Richard's jaw tightened. St. Catherine's cost $60,000 a year, and they couldn't teach his daughter basic mathematics. "I'll have Margaret call the agency. We'll find you the best tutor money can buy." But Emma was already walking away, her small frame disappearing down the hallway toward her room. Richard heard the soft click of her door closing, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. He told himself he'd talk to her later, after his conference call with Tokyo, after the board meeting, after the merger documents were reviewed. There was always something after. Meanwhile, 8 miles south in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath Penn Station, 11-year-old Keisha Washington huddled around a small battery-powered lantern with 3 other homeless children. Her dark skin glowed in the flickering light as she carefully tore pages from a water-damaged calculus textbook she'd salvaged from a Columbia University dumpster. "See, Maya," she said gently to the 6-year-old beside her, "numbers ain't scary. They're just waiting for us to understand their language." She used a piece of charcoal to write equations on the tunnel wall, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. "Education is the one thing they can never take from you, baby girl." Keisha had been homeless for 8 months, ever since her grandmother Ruby died of a stroke while standing at the blackboard of the Detroit Community Center, where she'd taught literacy classes for 30 years. The foster system had failed her, bouncing her between homes where she was just another mouth to feed, another check from the state. So she'd run, carrying nothing but her grandmother's worn copy of Advanced Mathematics for Young Minds, and a composition notebook filled with equations that danced in her dreams. Above ground, Richard closed another billion-dollar deal while Emma sat alone at their dining room table, picking at a meal prepared by their chef. Neither father nor daughter spoke during dinner, the silence stretching between them like an ocean neither knew how to cross. They lived in the same city, breathed the same air, but existed in completely different worlds, worlds that were about to collide in the most unexpected way imaginable. The late spring afternoon hung heavy with humidity as Emma Patterson slipped away from her nanny during their routine Central Park visit. Margaret had become predictably absorbed in her romance novel, barely glancing up as Emma mumbled something about needing the restroom and wandered toward the tree line. Emma's chest felt tight with the familiar weight of failure. Another math test, another red mark scrawled across the top in Mrs. Henderson's sharp handwriting. "See me after class." The fraction problems had swum before her eyes like indecipherable hieroglyphs, each number mocking her inability to understand what seemed to come so easily to her classmates. She found herself at the base of the massive oak tree that had become her refuge, its gnarled roots creating a natural seat away from the joggers and dog walkers. Pulling the crumpled test from her backpack, she stared at the sea of red corrections until her vision blurred with tears. "Mommy would have helped me," she whispered to the empty air, her voice catching on the words. Sarah Patterson had possessed infinite patience for homework struggles, turning kitchen tables into learning laboratories with measuring cups and cooking timers. But now the penthouse kitchen felt like a museum, sterile and untouched, and her father's impatient sighs had replaced her mother's encouraging smile. A gentle rustling in the bushes made Emma look up, hastily wiping her cheeks. A girl emerged from the undergrowth, maybe a year older than Emma, with intelligent dark eyes and clothes that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a makeshift ponytail secured with what looked like a rubber band, and she carried a worn canvas bag that bulged with mysterious contents. The girl noticed Emma's tear-stained face and the scattered homework papers dancing in the breeze. Without a word, she began chasing down the escaped worksheets, moving with surprising grace despite her threadbare sneakers. "Here you go," the girl said softly, offering Emma the rescued papers. Her voice carried a warmth that Emma hadn't heard in months, tinged with a slight southern accent that spoke of places far from Manhattan's polished edges. Emma accepted the papers, studying the girl's face with curiosity rather than the usual wariness her father had trained into her. "Thank you. I'm Emma." "Keisha," the girl replied, settling cross-legged on the grass without invitation. Her eyes fell on the math worksheet, and Emma tensed, expecting the familiar expression of pity or condescension. Instead, Keisha's face lit up with genuine interest. "Fractions giving you trouble?" she asked, pointing to the problems that had defeated Emma so thoroughly. Emma nodded miserably. "I just don't understand why you need common denominators." "It doesn't make sense." Keisha reached into her bag and pulled out a collection of items that would have looked like garbage to most people. Clean bottle caps, smooth pebbles, and broken pieces of colored chalk. "Mind if I show you something? Sometimes it helps to see it different." Before Emma could respond, Keisha had arranged the bottle caps in neat rows on the ground between them. "Pretend these are pizza slices," she began, her voice taking on the patient cadence of someone born to teach. "If I eat one slice out of 4 and you eat one slice out of 8, who ate more?" Emma frowned, studying the improvised visual aid. Keisha had separated the caps into groups, making the abstract concept suddenly concrete and understandable. "You did," Emma said slowly, "because your slice was bigger." "Exactly. But the numbers don't show that unless we make them speak the same language." "That's all common denominators are, making sure the numbers are talking about the same-sized pieces." For the next hour, Keisha transformed Emma's mathematical nemesis into an engaging puzzle. She used twigs to demonstrate division, drew diagrams in the dirt with her finger, and told stories that made numbers come alive. Emma found herself laughing for the first time in weeks as Keisha created a tale about fraction families trying to attend the same party. "You're really smart," Emma said when they'd successfully conquered every problem on the worksheet. "Smarter than my tutor at school." Keisha's smile faltered slightly, a shadow passing over her features. "I used to go to school," she said quietly. "My grandmother taught me that learning don't stop just because you ain't got a classroom." Emma noticed Keisha's careful avoidance of present tense, the way her eyes grew distant when she mentioned her grandmother. Questions bubbled up. Where did Keisha live? Where were her parents? Why wasn't she in school? But something in the older girl's expression warned Emma away from prying. Instead, Emma pulled her untouched lunch from her backpack, a gourmet sandwich prepared by their chef. "Are you hungry? I never eat all of this anyway." Keisha's eyes widened at the offering, and Emma caught a glimpse of desperate gratitude before pride reasserted itself on her features. "I couldn't take your lunch." "Please," Emma insisted, tearing the sandwich in half. "My friend taught me about sharing today. Seems like the least I can do." As they ate together under the oak tree's protective canopy, Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the loneliness that had gripped her for so long. Neither girl spoke of the obvious differences between them, the gulf of circumstances that should have kept them apart. Instead, they simply existed in that perfect bubble of childhood friendship, where kindness mattered more than appearances and intelligence was celebrated rather than commodified. What began as a chance encounter beneath the oak tree blossomed into something neither girl had expected, a friendship that transcended every boundary their worlds had constructed between them. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, while Margaret dozed over her paperback romances, Emma would slip away to meet Keisha by their tree, her heart racing with the thrill of rebellion and the deeper joy of genuine connection. Keisha arrived each time with her mysterious canvas bag, which Emma learned was a treasure trove of improvised teaching materials. Bottle caps became fractions, smooth stones transformed into multiplication tables, and broken chalk pieces drew geometric theorems across the park's concrete pathways. But more than the mathematics, Emma discovered something she'd been starving for since her mother's death. Someone who listened without judgment, who celebrated her small victories, and who never made her feel stupid for not understanding immediately. "Your brain works different than most folks," Keisha explained one afternoon as Emma struggled with a particularly complex word problem. "Ain't nothing wrong with that. My grandmother used to say some people see the forest, some see the trees, but the smartest ones learn to see both." Emma had never heard anyone describe her learning differences with such gentle acceptance. At St. Catherine's, her struggles were treated as deficiencies to be corrected through expensive tutoring and diagnostic testing. Here, under the oak tree, they became simply another facet of who she was, no more shameful than having blue eyes or blonde hair. The transformation in Emma's academic performance was swift and dramatic. Mrs. Henderson, who had written Emma off as another privileged child coasting on her father's donations, watched in amazement as test scores climbed from failing to exceptional. Emma's confidence bloomed like a flower finally receiving sunlight, her hand shooting up to answer questions that had once paralyzed her with anxiety. "Whatever you're doing differently, keep it up," Mrs. Henderson told her after class one Thursday. "I haven't seen improvement like this in 20 years of teaching." Emma beamed with pride, but her smile faded as she realized she couldn't share the source of her success. How could she explain that her breakthrough came not from expensive tutors or educational consultants, but from a homeless girl who turned learning into adventure? Meanwhile, Keisha found herself experiencing something equally foreign, the luxury of having someone genuinely care about her thoughts and dreams. Emma listened with rapt attention as Keisha shared stories about her grandmother Ruby, who had taught literacy classes in Detroit's most challenging neighborhoods until the day she died. "She used to say education was like planting seeds," Keisha remembered, her voice soft with memory. You might not see the flowers right away, but that don't mean they ain't growing underground, getting ready to bloom. Emma began to understand that Keisha's knowledge came not from expensive schools or private tutors, but from a love of learning so pure it survived even the harshest circumstances. She watched Keisha solve advanced calculus problems in the dirt, quote Shakespeare from memory, and explain historical events with the passion of someone who truly understood their relevance. "Where do you live?" Emma asked one day, the question that had been burning in her chest for weeks finally escaping. Keisha's hands stilled on the equation she'd been writing with a stick. "Different places," she said carefully. "I get by." Emma's privileged innocence couldn't quite grasp the reality behind those words, but she sensed the pain Keisha was trying to hide. She began bringing extra food to their meetings: sandwiches wrapped in cloth napkins, fruit from their penthouse kitchen, bottles of water that Keisha accepted with quiet gratitude. "You don't have to take care of me," Keisha said one afternoon as Emma unpacked what amounted to a small feast. "Friends take care of each other," Emma replied, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. "Besides, our chef makes way too much food anyway. It'll just go to waste." But Emma was beginning to understand that waste meant something entirely different to Keisha. She noticed how her friend saved every scrap, how she carefully folded the cloth napkins and tucked them into her bag, how her eyes widened at the casual abundance Emma took for granted. Their conversations began to shift as Emma's awareness grew. Keisha shared more stories about her underground community, other homeless children who looked out for each other, who shared whatever they could find, who created families from necessity and loyalty rather than blood. "There's this little girl, Maya," Keisha said, sketching mathematical symbols in the dirt as she talked. "She's only 6, but she's sharp as a tack. Reminds me of you, actually. She asks questions about everything." "What happened to her parents?" Emma asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "Same thing that happens to most of us. Life got hard, and the grown-ups couldn't handle it. Some parents leave, some get taken away, some just disappear." Emma tried to imagine her life without her father, distant as he'd become. The thought sent cold fingers of terror through her chest. But what about school? What about having a home? Keisha's smile held a sadness too old for her 11 years. "Home ain't always a building, Emma. Sometimes it's just people who care about you. And school." She gestured to their makeshift classroom beneath the oak tree. "Learning happens everywhere if you want it bad enough." As their friendship deepened, Emma began to see her own world through Keisha's eyes. The marble floors of her penthouse seemed excessive, the waste of her uneaten meals shameful, the casual dismissal of lesser people in her father's circles suddenly cruel. She started asking uncomfortable questions at home, questions that made Margaret shift uncomfortably and her father grow impatient. "Why do we have so much when other people don't have anything?" she asked Richard one evening over dinner. "That's just how the world works, sweetheart," he replied, barely looking up from his phone. "Some people work harder than others." But Emma had seen how hard Keisha worked, not just to survive, but to maintain her dignity, her intelligence, her capacity for kindness despite having every reason to be bitter. The easy answer her father offered crumbled in the face of that reality. The secret weight of her double life began to press on Emma's shoulders. She was living between two worlds that couldn't be more different, and she was starting to realize that eventually she would have to choose between them. The thought terrified her, because choosing meant potentially losing the best friend she'd ever had. The person who had given her back her confidence, her joy in learning, and her sense of possibility. But for now, she pushed those fears aside and treasured their stolen hours beneath the oak tree, where a billionaire's daughter and a homeless girl created their own universe governed only by curiosity, kindness, and the radical idea that friendship knew no boundaries. Neither girl realized that their secret was about to be exposed in the most devastating way possible. The first crack in their perfect world appeared on a humid Tuesday in late June, when Emma's academic transformation caught the attention of someone who had built her career on maintaining rigid boundaries between the worthy and the unworthy. Mrs. Victoria Ashford stood at the tall windows of her corner office at St. Catherine's Academy, her silver hair pulled into its customary severe bun, watching the summer light filter through the ancient oak trees that lined the school's manicured grounds. At 62, she had spent 4 decades as an educator, rising from a young teacher in Brooklyn's public schools to the headmistress of Manhattan's most exclusive private academy. Her reputation was built on unwavering standards and an uncanny ability to spot potential problems before they could threaten the institution's pristine reputation. Emma Patterson's sudden academic surge had triggered every alarm bell in Mrs. Ashford's carefully calibrated instincts. Children didn't simply leap from remedial mathematics to advanced problem-solving without intervention, and the most expensive tutors in New York hadn't produced even marginal improvement in the girl over the past 2 years. Something was different, something that made Emma's eyes light up when discussing equations that had once reduced her to tears. "Margaret," Mrs. Ashford said into her phone, summoning Emma's nanny with the crisp authority that had cowed parents and students alike for decades. "I need to speak with you about Emma's recent progress. This afternoon would be convenient." Margaret Murphy had worked for the Patterson family since Emma's birth, a sturdy Irish woman in her 50s who took pride in her discretion and reliability. She shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair across from Mrs. Ashford's imposing desk, her hands smoothing her sensible skirt as she tried to understand why Emma's improvement would concern anyone. "She's been happier lately," Margaret admitted, her accent softening the words with warmth. "More confident, you know, laughing again, which we haven't heard much of since her mother passed." Mrs. Ashford's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. "And you haven't noticed anything unusual about her behavior? No new influences, no changes in routine?" Margaret hesitated, loyalty warring with honesty. "Well, she has been more independent during our park visits. Less clingy, more willing to explore on her own. I thought it was a good sign, her gaining some confidence." "Which park?" Mrs. Ashford's question came sharp as a blade. "Central Park, usually. Mr. Patterson insisted on the routine after Mrs. Patterson's death. Fresh air, exercise, away from the penthouse." Margaret's voice grew defensive. "I always keep her in sight, of course." But even as she said it, Margaret felt a flutter of unease. Had she been watching as closely as she claimed? Those romance novels had grown more compelling lately, and Emma had seemed so content playing by herself near that big oak tree. Mrs. Ashford made careful notes, her fountain pen scratching across expensive paper. "I think it would be wise to maintain closer supervision, Margaret. 10-year-old girls can be remarkably naive about the dangers that surround them, especially in a city like New York." Meanwhile, across town in the abandoned subway tunnels that had become home to New York's invisible children, Keisha was sharing her own concerns with the makeshift family that had formed around necessity and mutual protection. Jerome Williams, 16 years old and aged beyond his years by the harsh realities of street life, listened with growing worry as Keisha described her friendship with Emma. He had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of their small group after aging out of a foster system that had failed him repeatedly, and his protective instincts were finely tuned to potential threats. "This white girl, she's rich, right?" Jerome asked, his dark eyes serious in the flickering light of their battery-powered lantern. "Lives in one of them fancy buildings uptown?" Keisha nodded, unconsciously clutching her composition notebook closer to her chest. "But she ain't like that, Jerome. She's kind, and she really wants to learn. She don't look at me like I'm dirt or nothing." "Baby girl," Jerome said gently, using the nickname he'd given her when she first arrived 8 months ago. Rich white folks got ways of looking at us that got nothing to do with kindness. They might seem nice when they want something, but when push comes to shove, little Maya, barely 6 years old with enormous dark eyes and a stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed, piped up from her corner where she'd been practicing the alphabet Keisha had taught her. Keisha's smart, though. She teaches good. Maybe the girl's family wants Keisha to be a real teacher. Jerome's expression softened as he looked at Maya, abandoned by parents who couldn't handle her developmental delays, but he shook his head. People like that don't see people like us as real teachers, sweetheart. They see us as problems to be solved or threats to be eliminated. But Keisha's heart was already too invested to listen to warnings, no matter how well-intentioned. Emma represented something precious, not just friendship, but hope that the world might be bigger and kinder than the harsh streets had taught her to believe. Back in the Patterson penthouse, Richard was experiencing his own moment of uncomfortable awareness. Emma's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by him either, though his recognition came filtered through the lens of parental guilt and the constant pressure of managing a business empire worth billions. He stood in his home office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park far below, reading Emma's latest report card with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. Every grade had improved dramatically, but more than that, her teachers noted a new engagement with learning, a curiosity and confidence that had been absent since Sarah's death. "Sir?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 4 o'clock is here." Richard glanced at his calendar, noting the appointment with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the child psychologist he'd hired to help Emma process her grief. Perhaps she could explain his daughter's sudden academic renaissance. Dr. Chen, a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, settled into the chair across from Richard's desk with Emma's file balanced on her lap. "I have to say, Richard, the change in Emma over the past month has been remarkable. She's more animated, more willing to engage in our sessions. Something significant has shifted in her emotional landscape." "The grades speak for themselves," Richard agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. "I just wish I understood what triggered it. We haven't changed tutors, haven't altered her routine significantly." Dr. Chen studied him with the careful attention that had made her one of New York's most sought-after child therapists. "Sometimes healing comes from unexpected sources. Children are remarkably resilient, but they also need connection, someone who sees them, understands them, believes in them." "Has Emma mentioned any new friendships? Someone who might be providing that emotional support?" Richard frowned, searching his memory for any mention of new friends. Emma had always been somewhat isolated, struggling to connect with her privileged classmates who seemed to exist in a bubble of entitlement that even at 10 years old felt foreign to her sensitive nature. "She's been more secretive lately," he admitted reluctantly. "More independent. I assumed it was part of growing up, asserting some autonomy. Or finding someone she trusts enough to share her authentic self with," Dr. Chen suggested gently. "The best thing you can do right now is create space for her to tell you about whatever or whoever is helping her heal." But Richard's schedule left little room for the kind of patient conversation Dr. Chen recommended. Board meetings, investor calls, and acquisition negotiations consumed his days, while evenings were spent reviewing reports and preparing for the next day's battles. He told himself he'd make time soon, that there would be an opportunity to really sit with Emma and understand her world. That opportunity would come sooner than he expected, and in a way that would shatter everything he thought he understood about his daughter's life. Mrs. Ashford, meanwhile, had taken matters into her own hands. Her discreet inquiries among the school's parent network had yielded disturbing information about increasing homeless activity in Central Park, particularly around the areas where children played unsupervised. Stories of aggressive panhandling, drug use, and worse had reached the ears of the city's elite families, creating a climate of fear and suspicion around anyone who didn't belong to their rarefied world. "I've hired a private investigator," she informed her assistant during their weekly planning meeting, "someone with experience in child welfare cases. We need to ensure that our students aren't being exposed to dangerous influences, particularly those who might exploit their innocent generosity." The investigator, a former police detective named Robert Hayes, had built a lucrative second career providing security and surveillance services to Manhattan's wealthy families. His methods were discreet but thorough, his reports detailed enough to satisfy the most paranoid parent while maintaining plausible deniability about any ethical gray areas. Hayes began his surveillance on a Thursday afternoon, positioning himself with professional invisibility near the oak tree that had become Emma and Keisha's sacred meeting place. Through his telephoto lens, he captured images that would later be used to justify actions he couldn't have imagined when he accepted the assignment. He watched Emma arrive first, her designer clothes and careful posture marking her immediately as one of the city's privileged children. She moved with purpose toward the tree, settling into what was clearly a familiar routine. Minutes later, a black girl emerged from the park's wilder areas carrying a canvas bag that looked like it contained the sum total of her worldly possessions. Hayes's trained eye cataloged details that would later be twisted into a narrative of danger and exploitation. Keisha's worn clothing, her careful scanning of the area before approaching Emma, the obvious difference in their circumstances. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he documented their interaction with the cold efficiency of someone who had learned to see threat in every shadow. What Hayes failed to capture in his photographs was the gentle patience in Keisha's voice as she helped Emma work through a complex geometry problem, or the genuine joy that lit up Emma's face when she finally grasped a concept that had eluded her for weeks. The camera couldn't record the careful way Keisha saved half of the sandwich Emma shared, or the reverent manner in which Emma listened to stories about Keisha's grandmother and her philosophy of education. Instead, Hayes saw what his client wanted him to see: a vulnerable, rich child being approached by a street kid who had every reason to take advantage of her innocence and generosity. His report, delivered to Mrs. Ashford the following morning, painted their friendship in the darkest possible terms. The subject appears to have established a pattern of unsupervised contact with a homeless minor of unknown background, Hayes wrote in his clinical prose. Given the disparity in their circumstances and the isolation of their meeting location, this relationship presents significant risk factors that warrant immediate intervention. Mrs. Ashford read the report with grim satisfaction, her worst suspicions confirmed. In her mind, she was protecting not just Emma, but the integrity of an educational system that had served New York's elite families for over a century. She had seen too many promising children derailed by inappropriate influences, too many families torn apart by naive choices that seemed harmless until it was too late. She picked up her phone to call Richard Patterson, already planning the conversation that would expose Emma's dangerous secret and end what she saw as a threat to everything St. Catherine's Academy represented. But Mrs. Ashford's intervention was about to collide with forces she hadn't considered: a father's buried memories, a child's fierce loyalty, and the unstoppable power of a friendship that had already changed two lives in ways that couldn't be undone. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the depth of Emma and Keisha's bond, but the fault lines running through a society that prided itself on opportunity while systematically denying it to those who needed it most. The phone call came at 11:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, interrupting Richard Patterson's review of quarterly projections with the jarring efficiency of a fire alarm. Mrs. Ashford's voice carried the crisp authority of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, each word carefully chosen to maximize impact while maintaining plausible concern. "Mr. Patterson, I'm calling about a situation involving Emma that requires your immediate attention, she began, her tone suggesting that delay would result in catastrophic consequences. I've discovered that she's been meeting unsupervised with a homeless child in Central Park. The situation presents significant safety and security risks that cannot be ignored. Richard's fingers tightened around his phone as Mrs. Ashford's words registered. The conference room around him seemed to fade into background noise, leaving only the headmistress's voice and the sudden hammering of his own heartbeat. "What do you mean, meeting with a homeless child?" he asked, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that his business rivals had learned to fear. "My investigation reveals that Emma has established a regular pattern of contact with an unaccompanied minor who appears to be living on the streets. They meet by the large oak tree near the sheep meadow, apparently for what the child presents as tutoring sessions." Mrs. Ashford paused, allowing the implications to settle. Given Emma's academic improvement, it's possible she's been led to believe this person is providing legitimate educational assistance. The words hit Richard like physical blows. His daughter, his precious Emma, alone with a stranger who could be anyone capable of anything. The protective fury that rose in his chest was immediate and overwhelming, drowning out any capacity for rational analysis. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, already standing, already reaching for his coat. "Based on the timing of Emma's academic changes, I estimate several weeks at minimum. Mr. Patterson, I understand this is alarming, but it's crucial that you handle this situation delicately. Confronting Emma directly might only drive her to become more secretive about these meetings." But Richard was already moving, his assistant scrambling to keep up as he strode toward the elevator. "Cancel my meetings," he barked over his shoulder. "Everything for the rest of the day." Mrs. Ashford's satisfied smile couldn't be heard through the phone, but it colored her final words. "I've taken the liberty of coordinating with park security. They'll be standing by to assist if needed. The safety of our students must always be our primary concern." 20 minutes later, Richard's black Mercedes pulled into the Central Park parking area with the urgency of an ambulance call. He moved through the park with purpose, his expensive suit and obvious wealth drawing curious glances from joggers and tourists. Every homeless person he passed became a potential threat in his mind, every shadowy corner a place where his daughter might be in danger. The oak tree stood exactly where Mrs. Ashford had described it, its ancient branches creating a natural canopy that offered both shelter and privacy. As Richard approached, he could hear voices, Emma's familiar laugh mixed with another voice, younger but carrying an authority that seemed impossible given what he'd been told about its owner. He moved closer, using the tree's massive trunk for cover, and peered around to see his daughter sitting cross-legged on the grass beside a black girl who couldn't have been much older than Emma herself. Between them, an array of makeshift teaching materials was spread across the ground like a miniature classroom. "Now watch this," the other girl was saying, her voice patient and encouraging as she used twigs to demonstrate a complex geometric principle. "When you got two triangles like this, and you know they got the same angles, you can figure out all kinds of stuff about how big they are." Emma's face was transformed with concentration and delight, more animated than Richard had seen her since before Sarah's death. She was asking questions, making connections, building on concepts with an enthusiasm that had been absent from every expensive tutoring session they'd endured. "That's amazing, Keisha," Emma exclaimed as understanding dawned. "So it's like the triangles are talking to each other, telling each other their secrets." Keisha grinned, her whole face lighting up with the joy of a born teacher seeing her student grasp a difficult concept. "That's exactly right, Em. You got it now. Your mama would be so proud of how smart you are." The mention of Sarah hit Richard like a physical blow, followed immediately by a surge of rage that this stranger dared to invoke his dead wife's name. But beneath the anger, something else stirred. a recognition he couldn't quite place, a familiarity that made his hands tremble as he watched Keisha's gentle teaching methods. The teaching style, the patient repetition, the use of everyday objects to make abstract concepts concrete. It was achingly familiar, though he couldn't place why. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, another teacher's voice whispered with the same warmth and patience. Another set of hands had demonstrated mathematical principles with whatever materials were available. But the anger was stronger than the recognition, fueled by Mrs. Ashford's warnings and his own protective instincts. He stepped out from behind the tree, his shadow falling across their impromptu classroom like a storm cloud. "Emma?" His daughter's head snapped up, her face cycling rapidly through surprise, guilt, and fear. Keisha scrambled to her feet with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to quick escapes, her composition notebook clutched protectively against her chest. "Daddy, I can explain," Emma began, but Richard's attention was fixed on Keisha, cataloging details with the cold assessment of a man accustomed to identifying threats. She was thin, obviously malnourished, her clothes clean, but worn past any hope of respectability. Her hair was carefully braided despite its obvious need for professional attention, and her shoes had holes that had been covered with duct tape. But her posture remained straight, her chin lifted with a dignity that seemed incongruous with her circumstances. "Step away from my daughter," Richard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Keisha took a careful step backward, but her eyes never left Emma's face. "Emma, you okay?" she asked softly, her concern obviously genuine despite her own vulnerable position. The simple question, the obvious care behind it, only inflamed Richard's protective fury. "Don't you dare speak to her. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it ends now." "Daddy, stop!" Emma jumped to her feet, positioning herself between her father and Keisha with surprising courage. "She's not playing any game. She's my friend, and she's been helping me with math. She's the best teacher I've ever had." Richard's expression darkened at what he interpreted as manipulation. "Emma, get away from her. Now! You don't understand what's happening here." But Emma's small face was set with determination he'd never seen before. "I understand perfectly. Keisha is smart and kind and patient, and she's been helping me when no one else could. She never asked for anything, never tried to hurt me. She just wanted to help." Keisha placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder, the gesture protective rather than possessive. "It's okay, Em. Your daddy's just worried about you. That's what good daddies do." The words were meant to diffuse the situation, but they had the opposite effect on Richard. The idea that this street child was commenting on his parenting, positioning herself as an authority on family dynamics, pushed his anger beyond rational thought. "Don't you dare tell me about being a good father," he snarled, pulling out his phone. "Security will be here in minutes. I suggest you disappear before they arrive." But even as he made the threat, Richard found himself studying Keisha's face more carefully. There was something about her expressions, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the careful precision of her speech, despite her obvious lack of formal education. The familiarity nagged at him like a half-remembered dream, persistent and troubling. Emma burst into tears, her small frame shaking with the force of her emotions. "You're ruining everything. She's my friend, and she cares about me, and you're being mean and horrible." The accusation hit Richard like a slap, followed immediately by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mrs. Ashford emerged from behind a cluster of trees, flanked by two park security officers whose presence transformed the situation from a family disagreement into something far more serious. "Mr. Patterson," Mrs. Ashford said with grim satisfaction, "I'm glad we arrived in time to prevent this situation from escalating further." Keisha's composure finally cracked at the sight of the security officers, her eyes darting between potential escape routes with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to run when authority figures appeared. but Emma's desperate grip on her hand anchored her to the spot, loyalty warring with self-preservation. "Please don't let them take her away," Emma sobbed, clinging to Keisha with desperate strength. "She's the only person who understands me. She makes me feel smart and important and loved." The words tore through Richard's anger like bullets, each one finding its mark in the guilt he'd been carrying since Sarah's death. His daughter felt unloved, unimportant, misunderstood, and she'd found those things from a homeless stranger while her own father buried himself in work and meetings and the comfortable distance of busy schedules. But Mrs. Ashford's voice cut through his moment of self-reflection with surgical precision. "Emma, you need to understand that this person has been taking advantage of your generous nature. People in her situation often target children from wealthy families, hoping to gain access to money or resources through manipulation." Keisha flinched, as if she'd been physically struck, the accusation hitting her in the place where her pride and dignity lived. "I never asked her for nothing," she said quietly, her voice carrying a pain that made Emma cry harder. "Not money, not food, not nothing. I just wanted to help her learn." "That's exactly what someone with ulterior motives would say," Mrs. Ashford replied coldly, signaling to the security officers. "We need to end this inappropriate relationship immediately, for everyone's protection." As the officers moved forward, Richard found himself frozen between competing impulses. Every instinct screamed at him to protect his daughter, to remove her from what Mrs. Ashford insisted was a dangerous situation. But Keisha's quiet dignity, Emma's desperate pleas, and the nagging familiarity of the teaching methods he'd witnessed created a storm of doubt in his chest. The moment of choice had arrived, and whatever decision he made would change the trajectory of all their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The decision Richard made in that moment would haunt him for weeks to come. Faced with the authority of Mrs. Ashford's certainty, the presence of security officers, and his own overwhelming need to protect Emma from perceived danger, he chose what seemed like the safe path. "Take Emma home," he told Margaret, who had arrived breathless and apologetic, drawn by Mrs. Ashford's urgent phone call. "I'll handle this situation." Emma's scream of protest echoed across the park as Margaret gently but firmly guided her away from Keisha. "No, Daddy, please! You don't understand. She's good. She's my friend." Keisha stood perfectly still as the security officers flanked her, her composition notebook still clutched against her chest like armor. She didn't resist when they asked for identification she didn't possess, didn't argue when they explained she was being banned from the park for soliciting minors. Her dignity remained intact even as her world crumbled around her. "Emma," she called out as Margaret pulled the sobbing girl toward the parking area. "Remember what we learned about triangles, okay? They tell each other their secrets. Don't forget." Mrs. Ashford watched the scene with grim satisfaction, certain she had prevented a tragedy. "You made the right choice, Mr. Patterson. These situations can escalate quickly when children become emotionally attached to inappropriate influences." But Richard couldn't shake the image of Keisha's face as the officers escorted her away, not defiant or angry as he'd expected, but profoundly sad, as if she'd witnessed something precious being destroyed by forces beyond her control. The drive home to their penthouse was a nightmare of Emma's inconsolable weeping and Richard's growing uncertainty about his decision. Emma refused to speak to him, turning her face to the window and sobbing with the broken-hearted intensity that only children can achieve when their world is suddenly upended by adult choices they can't understand. "She was helping me, Daddy," Emma finally whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "She made me feel smart. She made me feel like Mommy was still here, helping me learn." Those words lodged in Richard's chest like shards of glass, each one a reminder of his own failures as a parent. He'd been so focused on providing Emma with material security that he'd forgotten to provide the emotional connection she desperately needed. That night, Emma refused dinner, refused her bath, refused every attempt Richard made to comfort her. She locked herself in her room, and through the door he could hear her trying to work through math problems alone, stumbling over concepts that had flowed so naturally when Keisha was there to guide her. The next morning brought the full weight of his decision's consequences. Emma's transformation reversed itself overnight, not just academically, but emotionally. She moved through their penthouse like a ghost, mechanically completing basic tasks, but showing no spark of the enthusiasm that had recently returned to her life. Mrs. Henderson called from school after Emma's first day back. "I don't understand what's happened," the teacher said, concern evident in her voice. "It's as if she's forgotten everything she'd learned. She won't participate, won't even try to answer questions. She just sits there, staring out the window." Richard ended the call and found himself pacing his office, unable to focus on the reports and contracts that usually commanded his complete attention. Emma's words echoed in his mind. She made me feel like Mommy was still here. Sarah had possessed that same patient teaching style, the same ability to break down complex concepts into manageable pieces. She'd spent hours with Emma, turning homework into adventures, making learning feel like play. After Sarah's death, Richard had hired the best tutors money could buy, but none of them had understood that Emma needed more than academic instruction. She needed someone who could reach her heart while teaching her mind. Dr. Chen's emergency session that Thursday afternoon confirmed Richard's worst fears. Emma sat curled in the corner of the psychologist's office, her small frame radiating a dejection that made her seem even younger than her 10 years. "She's regressed significantly," Dr. Chen explained quietly while Emma stared at the carpet. The friend she mentioned, Keisha, apparently provided something crucial that Emma needed for her healing process. Without that connection, she's retreating back into the protective shell she built after her mother's death. "But she was homeless," Richard protested, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "A stranger." "We don't know anything about her background, her motivations." Dr. Chen's expression was gentle but firm. "Children are remarkably good judges of character, Richard." Emma's trust wasn't given lightly or naively. Sometimes healing comes from unexpected sources, and trying to control or eliminate those sources can do more harm than the risks we're trying to prevent. That evening, Richard sat in Emma's room as she lay in bed, her back turned to him, her silence more devastating than any angry words could have been. "Emma, sweetheart, I need you to understand that I was trying to protect you," he began, his voice thick with emotion he'd been suppressing for days. "That girl, Keisha, she's living in dangerous circumstances. I was scared something might happen to you." Emma's voice came muffled from her pillow, small and broken. "Something did happen to me, Daddy. I lost my best friend. I lost the person who made me feel smart and special and loved. And you took her away from me." The accusation hit Richard like a physical blow, followed by a realization that made his blood run cold. In trying to protect Emma from perceived danger, he'd destroyed the one relationship that had brought her joy and confidence. He'd become the threat to her happiness, not Keisha. "She never asked me for anything," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength from her pain. "Not money, not food, not anything. She just wanted to help me learn because she said every child deserves to feel smart. She told me stories about her grandmother who was a teacher, and she made math feel like magic." Richard's hands trembled as Emma's words painted a picture that contradicted everything Mrs. Ashford had told him. This wasn't a manipulative street child taking advantage of a wealthy family. This was a young teacher carrying on her grandmother's legacy, sharing knowledge despite having nothing material to gain. "Daddy, do you remember when you were little?" Emma asked suddenly, turning to face him for the first time in days. "Did anyone ever help you when you really needed it?" The question hit Richard like lightning, unlocking memories he'd buried beneath decades of success and carefully constructed identity. Suddenly, he was 12 years old again, homeless and hungry on the streets of Detroit, saved by a woman whose kindness had literally meant the difference between life and death. Mrs. Ruby Johnson, who had found him sleeping in an abandoned building and brought him to the community center where she taught literacy classes. Mrs. Ruby Johnson, who had fed him, clothed him, and most importantly, taught him that education was the pathway out of poverty. Mrs. Ruby Johnson, whose patient teaching methods had given him the mathematical foundation that eventually led to his technology empire. The teaching style he'd witnessed in the park, the patient repetition, the use of everyday objects to explain complex concepts, it was exactly how Ruby had taught him 40 years ago. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of recognition and regret. "Tell me more about Keisha's grandmother. What was her name?" Emma sat up, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the confrontation in the park. "Ruby Johnson. Keisha said she taught children in Detroit until she died. She said her grandmother believed that love could teach anyone anything, and that's why Keisha wanted to teach me." The name hit Richard like a tsunami, washing away 40 years of carefully constructed distance from his impoverished past. Ruby Johnson hadn't just been his teacher, she'd been his savior, his inspiration, the foundation upon which his entire life was built. And her granddaughter, carrying on her legacy of selfless education, had been helping his daughter in exactly the same way Ruby had once helped him. He'd destroyed a connection that was not only beneficial but sacred, breaking a chain of generosity that had literally shaped his existence. The homeless child he'd seen as a threat was the granddaughter of the woman who had saved his life, and he'd treated her with the same prejudice and fear that others might have shown him decades earlier. The irony was devastating, the guilt overwhelming, and the realization that he might have lost the chance to honor Ruby's memory through her granddaughter felt like a betrayal of everything good that had ever happened to him. Richard Patterson, billionaire and protector of his daughter, had become the very kind of person who would have turned his back on a 12-year-old Richard Patterson sleeping in the cold. The revelation about Ruby Johnson sent Richard into a tailspin of memories and regret that consumed the next 48 hours. He canceled meetings, ignored calls from his board of directors, and spent his time poring through old documents he'd kept locked away in his personal safe, photographs, letters, and certificates from a life he'd tried to forget. There she was, in a faded Polaroid from 1983, Mrs. Ruby Johnson, her kind face beaming as she stood beside 12-year-old Richard at his first community center graduation ceremony. She wore the same patient expression he'd seen on Keisha's face, the same gentle authority that turned teaching into an act of love rather than obligation. Emma found him sitting on the floor of his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by these artifacts of his buried past, tears streaming down his face as he held a handwritten note Ruby had given him the day he'd aged out of her program. "Richard," the note read in Ruby's careful cursive, "education is a gift that keeps giving itself away. Promise me that when you find success, you'll remember to reach back and pull someone else up. That's how we change the world. One child, one lesson, one act of kindness at a time." Emma knelt beside her father, her own pain temporarily forgotten in the face of his obvious anguish. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Richard looked at his daughter through his tears, seeing Sarah's compassion in her eyes and Ruby's wisdom in her gentle concern for others. "I made a terrible mistake, sweetheart. The worst mistake of my life." Over the next hour, Richard told Emma everything about his childhood homelessness, about Ruby Johnson's rescue and patient teaching, about how everything he'd achieved was built on the foundation of one woman's selfless dedication to educating forgotten children. Emma listened with growing amazement, understanding for the first time that her father hadn't always lived in penthouses and boardrooms. "So, Keisha's grandmother was the teacher who saved your life?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with the symmetry of it all. "And I repaid that debt by treating her granddaughter like a criminal," Richard said, his voice thick with shame. "I became exactly the kind of person who would have turned their back on me when I needed help most." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation and its implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried a maturity that startled Richard with its clarity. "Maybe it's not too late to fix it, Daddy. Maybe we can still do the right thing." But finding Keisha proved more challenging than Richard had anticipated. His inquiries with park security yielded only the information that she'd been officially banned from Central Park and hadn't been seen since the confrontation. The underground community she'd mentioned to Emma seemed to have vanished like smoke, leaving no trace for his private investigators to follow. Richard's guilt deepened as days passed without any sign of the girl who carried Ruby Johnson's legacy. He imagined her cold and hungry somewhere in the city, driven deeper underground by his actions, her trust in the goodness of others shattered by his prejudice and fear. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Ashford appeared at his office on a Tuesday morning, her usual composure cracked by something that looked suspiciously like conscience. "Mr. Patterson," she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I need to discuss the situation with Emma and that homeless child. There are things about my motivations that I haven't been entirely honest about." Richard gestured for her to sit, noting the tremor in her hands as she settled into the chair across from his desk. For the first time since he'd known her, Victoria Ashford looked her age, the stern mask of authority replaced by the face of a woman carrying unbearable guilt. "8 years ago," she began slowly, "my son David was driving home from college when he struck and killed a homeless teenager who ran into traffic. The boy was being chased by someone David couldn't identify, someone who disappeared before police arrived." Richard felt a chill of premonition as Mrs. Ashford's story unfolded. The investigation revealed that the boy wasn't stealing anything, wasn't threatening anyone. He was just hungry, scared, looking for food or shelter. But David spent the rest of his life believing he'd killed a criminal, a threat to society. The guilt consumed him until he took his own life 3 years later. Mrs. Ashford's voice broke as she continued. "I blamed that homeless boy for destroying my family. I told myself that if he hadn't been on the streets, if someone had controlled the homeless population better, my son would still be alive. I've spent the last 5 years seeing every homeless child as a potential threat, a tragedy waiting to happen." The confession hung in the air between them like a poison finally expelled. Richard understood now why Mrs. Ashford had reacted so strongly to Emma's friendship with Keisha, why she'd been so determined to separate them regardless of the obvious benefits to Emma's well-being. "But watching Emma these past days," Mrs. Ashford whispered, "seeing what my intervention has done to her, I realize I've become the monster I thought I was protecting children from. I've been punishing innocent children for my family's tragedy." Richard leaned forward, his voice gentle despite his anger at what her actions had cost them all. "Where is Keisha, Mrs. Ashford? What did your investigators find, Mrs.?" Ashford pulled out a manila folder with trembling hands. "She's in Bellevue Hospital. Pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition. She was found unconscious in an abandoned building in Queens 3 days ago. The doctors say she might not have survived another night on the streets." The news hit Richard like a physical blow. While he'd been searching for Keisha to make amends, she'd been fighting for her life, driven to dangerous shelter by the very actions he'd taken to protect his daughter. "I'll cover all medical expenses," Mrs. Ashford said quickly. "It's the least I can do." "But Mr. Patterson, there's something else. The hospital found her composition notebook, and I had one of our mathematics teachers review it. The work in there is extraordinary. College-level calculus, advanced geometric proofs, theoretical mathematics that most graduate students would struggle with. She's not just intelligent, she's genuinely brilliant. Richard was already standing, reaching for his coat. Emma and I are going to the hospital now. Mr. Patterson, wait, Mrs. Ashford called after him. There's one more thing. I've been in contact with the city's Child Services Department. Keisha has no known relatives, no legal guardian. When she's released from the hospital, she'll be placed in the foster care system unless... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Richard understood the implications, the opportunity for redemption that had been placed before him. Ruby Johnson had saved his life by taking in a homeless child and giving him education, purpose, and hope. Now he had the chance to honor that debt by doing the same for her granddaughter. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to protect Emma from Keisha, he'd actually been given the opportunity to give both girls what they needed most, each other. At Bellevue Hospital, Richard and Emma found Keisha in the pediatric ward, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines monitoring her recovery. Her composition notebook sat on the bedside table, its worn cover testament to the dreams and knowledge it contained. Emma rushed to the bedside, tears streaming down her face as she saw her friend's condition. Keisha, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. Keisha's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Emma's face. Despite her illness, despite everything that had happened, her smile was radiant with joy at seeing her friend again. Em, she whispered, her voice hoarse but warm. You came. Richard approached the bed slowly, his throat tight with emotion as he looked at the girl who carried his savior's blood. Keisha, my name is Richard Patterson. I'm Emma's father, and I owe you an apology that can never be big enough for what I've done. Keisha's eyes moved to his face, studying him with the same careful intelligence he'd seen her use when teaching Emma. You were just protecting your little girl, sir. I understand that. But Richard shook his head, pulling up a chair beside the bed. No, Keisha. I was being something worse than protective. I was being prejudiced and cruel and ungrateful. You see, I knew your grandmother. Ruby Johnson saved my life when I was 12 years old, just like you've been saving Emma's happiness. Keisha's eyes widened with shock and recognition. You're the boy, she whispered, the one in the pictures. Grandma Ruby kept pictures of all her success stories, but you were her favorite. She said you were proof that education could change anything, overcome anything. The confirmation hit Richard like lightning, connecting 40 years of success to this moment of reckoning. He took Keisha's small hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and survival, the gentle strength that had guided Emma back to confidence and joy. Keisha, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer is okay. Would you consider letting Emma and me be your family? Not because we feel sorry for you, not because we want to fix our mistakes, but because you've already proven you belong with us. You've been Emma's best teacher, her truest friend, and the bridge back to her mother's memory. Emma held her breath as Keisha considered the offer, her eyes moving between father and daughter as she processed what was being asked of her. You really want me? Keisha asked quietly. Even knowing I come from nothing, even knowing I got no money or fancy clothes or proper education? Richard's voice broke as he answered, Keisha, you come from Ruby Johnson, which means you come from everything that matters. You have her gift for teaching, her capacity for kindness, her ability to see potential where others see problems. Emma and I would be honored to have you as part of our family. Keisha looked at Emma, who was nodding so enthusiastically she was practically bouncing. We'd be sisters, Emma whispered. Real sisters. For the first time since her grandmother's death, Keisha allowed herself to believe in the possibility of home, of belonging, of a future that stretched beyond mere survival into something that looked remarkably like hope. 3 months later, the autumn light filtered through the tall windows of the Patterson penthouse as Keisha sat at the kitchen island, her homework spread across the marble surface like a constellation of possibility. The St. Catherine's Academy uniform fit her perfectly now. The crisp white shirt and navy blazer a stark contrast to the torn clothes she'd worn that day in the park. Emma bounced into the kitchen, her own homework completed with the confidence that had returned stronger than ever. "Keisha, did you finish the calculus problems Mrs. Henderson assigned?" Keisha looked up from her work, grinning at her sister. For that's what they'd become, not just legally through Richard's adoption proceedings, but in every way that mattered. "Finished an hour ago. Want me to check yours?" The easy rhythm of their relationship had amazed everyone who witnessed it. Two girls from impossibly different worlds had found in each other not just friendship, but the missing pieces of their own hearts. Emma had gained the patient teacher and loyal companion she'd craved since her mother's death, while Keisha had found the family and stability that allowed her brilliant mind to flourish without the constant anxiety of survival. Richard entered the kitchen, loosening his tie after another long day of board meetings and conference calls. But these days, his evening routine included something that had been missing for too long: unhurried time with his daughters. "How was school today, girls?" he asked, settling onto a stool beside them with genuine interest rather than obligatory inquiry. "Amazing," Emma said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Keisha helped 3 other kids with their math during lunch, and Mrs. Henderson said she's never seen tutoring methods like Keisha's before. Richard smiled, watching Keisha's cheeks flush with pleased embarrassment. The transformation in both girls had been remarkable, but Keisha's journey from street survival to academic excellence had been nothing short of miraculous. Her composition notebook, once filled with equations practiced in solitude, now overflowed with advanced theorems she discussed with Columbia University professors who'd heard about her exceptional abilities. "Dr. Chen wants to talk to you both tomorrow after school," Richard said, his voice carrying news that made both girls look up with interest. "She's been working with the Ruby Johnson Foundation on a special project." The foundation had been Richard's first act of public redemption, established with an initial endowment of $50 million to provide educational opportunities for homeless and at-risk children. Named in honor of the woman who had saved his life and whose granddaughter had saved his soul, it had already begun changing lives across New York City. Mrs. Ashford, transformed by her own journey from prejudice to understanding, had become the foundation's educational director. Her experience at St. Catherine's, combined with her newfound commitment to serving all children regardless of their circumstances, had made her an unexpected but passionate advocate for educational equity. "The foundation wants to create a new teaching method," Richard continued, "based on Keisha's grandmother's techniques and Keisha's own innovations. They want to train other educators to reach children who learn differently, children who might otherwise fall through the cracks." Keisha's eyes filled with tears of joy and pride. "Grandma Ruby would love that," she whispered. "She always said that good teaching was like planting seeds. You might not see all the flowers, but they keep growing and spreading." Emma reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. "We'll help other kids the way you helped me, the way your grandmother helped Daddy." That evening, as autumn rain tapped against the penthouse windows, Richard found both girls curled up together on the living room sofa. Keisha reading aloud from one of Ruby Johnson's old teaching journals, while Emma listened with rapt attention. The scene embodied everything he'd almost lost through his own prejudice and fear: love, learning, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to see beyond surface differences to the hearts beneath. The homeless girl who had once taught his daughter under an oak tree was now his daughter too, carrying forward a legacy of education and compassion that would outlive them all. In saving Keisha, he had discovered that she had actually saved him, completing a circle of kindness that began with Ruby Johnson 40 years ago and would continue through generations yet to come. Some teachers change one life. The best ones change the world, one heart at a time. This story reminds us that the greatest gifts often come wrapped in unexpected packages. Richard Patterson, despite his billions, had forgotten the most valuable lesson from his childhood, that kindness recognizes no boundaries of race or class. When we allow fear and prejudice to guide our decisions, we risk destroying the very connections that could heal our hearts. Like many of us who've achieved success later in life, Richard had buried his humble beginnings, but it was a homeless child who helped him rediscover his humanity. Emma's friendship with Keisha wasn't just about math tutoring, it was about two souls finding exactly what they needed in each other. As we navigate our golden years, surrounded by grandchildren we sometimes struggle to understand, this story challenges us to look beyond appearances and expectations. Maybe that different child in your family, that neighbor you've dismissed, that person you avoid eye contact with on the street, carries exactly the gift you need. Ruby Johnson's legacy lived on, not in buildings or monuments, but in acts of selfless teaching that rippled across generations. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in lives touched and hearts changed. What unexpected person has taught you life's most valuable lesson? Have you ever missed an opportunity to help someone because of your own assumptions about them? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.